My name is Franklin Easton. I own Ironstone Performance here in Seattle, Washington. I'm a strongman competitor, a strength coach, and today I'm going to talk about what I view as the three big levers of getting stronger. If you want to improve a given lift, these are the three big things you need to improve to get stronger. It's going to be improving your technique, moving more efficiently. If you're able to move with more mechanical efficiency, you're able to save energy and move more weight. Creating a stronger neuromuscular efficiency. And it's another kind of efficiency, but it's being able to send a signal from your brain to your muscle quickly, all at once with coordination. And then the last piece is going to be muscle mass. That signal going to your muscle has to have something there to operate on. If you had no muscle at the end of it, that signal kind of goes nowhere. You have to have a large enough muscle to actually do the lift at the whatever the actual acting muscle is, not only of the lift itself, let's take the squat for example, the quads as well as the hips, but also the upper back, the core. Those all need to be sufficiently neuromuscularly developed as well as have enough muscle mass. So to go through each in a little bit more detail and then going into how you might consider them with training and programming, the technique efficiency is just trying to create mechanical efficiency, trying to move without wasting energy. I'll make a separate video going into more detail here down the road, but the broader idea is we're trying to load, the stronger mechanical structures that are going to allow us to lift the most weight. I personally view that as a long-term strategy. It's not what allows you to lift the most weight right now, but what allows you to lift the most weight long-term. And I'll get a little more detail of that in that other video. But for today, we'll just leave that at mechanical efficiency. The second piece is the neuromuscular efficiency, being able to send a strong signal from your brain to your muscle, being able to output force quickly with a high amount of force. So when you are pushing that signal to your brain, to your quads, from your brain to your quads all at once, it can't be that it takes 10 seconds to contract. It needs to contract relatively quickly for you to stand up with maximal weights. Doesn't mean the weight moves fast, but your body still is sending that signal with force. If you do not have the practice of sending that signal, you have not developed that ability. That's also why beginners are able to get strong really fast. They're able to get strong in the first week or two, not because they've built much muscle. They're a little bit more mechanically efficient, but the biggest thing is they're sending that a stronger neural signal from their brain to their muscle because they just haven't built that coordination previously. The final piece is muscle mass, just having a bigger muscle, having a bigger area for that brain to send the signal to your muscle. There's more meat there. That is going to be the largest long-term driver of strength. And the neuromuscular adaptations are relatively limited by the muscle size, where what's actually at the end point limits how much of a signal you can send. So like you have a car that has a chassis which is too rickety, too rusty and undeveloped for the huge engine you've put into it. It's just not going to work. And in order to keep you safe, your body doesn't let you send a strong enough signal that exceeds the size of the muscle. But you can increase you're able to use a bigger engine and get more horsepower out of just a stronger and larger chassis. Just a bigger car can handle a bigger engine. No, I'm not a car guy. That analogy may not totally work, but the idea of you are sort of limited by that weakest link, and the long-term highest ceiling for what you can develop is going to be that muscle mass. With actually selecting programs and how to structure around these things for learning technique, for that technique acquisition, starting with somebody who's a beginner, the classic personal training wisdom, which I think is very wrong, is start someone with low weight, high reps so they can learn technique. Now, I don't think high reps is a great way to learn technique. If you were going to do a set of 20 on squats, when you get to rep 15, are you really putting a lot of intent and focus and effort into executing each rep well? Or are you just trying to get the set over with? In my experience, people are just trying to get it done and they're tired and they're out of breath. And particularly if they're a beginner, they aren't in that good of a shape. So they don't know how to push themselves with high rep sets. So they're probably the worst person to give a high rep set of squats to learn how to squat. What I think is a much better approach is to reduce the number of reps, somewhere in the 3 to 6 range, I think is ideal. Potentially increase the number of sets, but not always required. And then keep the weight more moderate. we don't want the weight to be so heavy that if they make a mistake with technique, they are going to miss the weight or they're worried about missing the weight. We don't want them distracted by the load. We also don't want the weight so ridiculously easy that they can do it no matter what way they do it, and there's no feedback when they do it wrong. So if you were squatting a PVC pipe, and really maybe you should be squatting 85 pounds, let's say, to start out, but you're squatting a PVC pipe instead, you're not going to get enough feedback to know, am I using good technique? When is this technique off? When is it right? There's no sensory feedback at all. It's just, they all kind of feel the same no matter how you do it. But if you have enough weight to give you some feedback, you know, okay, I lost a little position there. That wasn't quite as tight. I could feel the difference between reps. That is that sweet spot to start someone out with, so they can get, every time they do a rep, they are learning what's going on, what's right, what's wrong, especially if they've got a good coach in front of them, giving them feedback, telling them which ones are the ones they want to reproduce. It's enough weight that they can feel the difference. And with someone saying that, do those reps, not those reps, they can more consistently find the direction they need to go, and they can more consistently find what good technique looks like. As someone progresses in their abilities, as someone progresses as a lifter, their ability to do reps consistently becomes narrower. So when someone's starting out as a beginner, every reps look wildly different for the most part. People are different at this, but to start out, there's more variance in how one rep looks compared to another. As they become more advanced, the reps look more similar. Because of that, the load you can take with someone to learn technique becomes higher. Because they're making reps more similar, you can take a heavier weight, and they might be making tiny technique deviations, but it's still not a weight they're worried about missing. It's still a weight that, with a technique deviation, they're not going to miss. And that's still that sweet spot to train in. It starts to scale as someone gets more advanced, and that technique execution range gets narrower. With the neuromuscular efficiency portion of training, we're really just teaching the body to send a signal from your brain to your muscle quickly. And the rep count required for that typically is on the lower end compared to the learning to move, learning technique side of things. I think the 5, even down to 1 rep range is sort of where that's best done, where you're teaching that efficiency. But the difficulty, especially to be able to manage it in training with any sort of frequency, needs to be relatively low. I think the low end of difficulty for the neuromuscular adaptations is going to be RP 4 to 5, and to be able to fit it in with any regularity, probably shouldn't go much over an 8, maybe a 9. 9 should really be the cap. And that would be only occasionally, or every once in a while hitting a 9. That will improve neuromuscular efficiency. A 10 will definitely improve it, but it's going to wipe you out probably for such a period of time that it cannot be a regular staple in training. But you certainly will improve neuromuscular efficiency from 10s. But it's the frequency by which you need to take heavier weights for the neural adaptations to happen. It should not be a regular staple in training. The set counts can be a bit higher there because you're just getting practice, especially if you're in the RPE 6 range for sets of 3. You can handle quite a few sets in that rep range at that difficulty range without issue, and get a lot of value of improving that efficiency. Once you've mastered your technique, you are then sending a better signal from your brain to your muscles in the correct coordination to be able to lift efficiently with force. Now, with that, you are limited by how much muscle mass you have. If you do not have enough muscle mass, you will not be able to lift enough. Your signal will be not strong enough. You cannot out technique and out neuromuscular a big weight. It just can't happen. That's why weight classes matter. That's why putting on size long-term matters for long-term strength development to maximize strength. The biggest thing for building muscle mass is going to be long-term volume, doing enough total work. It has to be hard enough. The RPE, or the difficulty range for hypertrophy, is going to be a bit higher than it is for neuromuscular. It's going to be kind of in the 7 to 9, 7 to 10 range. Much like the neuromuscular, but to a lesser extent. Going to 10s all the time is really fatiguing. Can't be an all the time thing, but it is typically less fatiguing, assuming it's done with good technique, than something like the neuromuscular range. Taking a heavy double to failure is a bit more taxing than taking a set of 15 to failure, even if it's a pretty hard set. Or even if it's a lot of reps, you're exhausted, but its impact on future training is just generally lesser. But just long-term volume is going to be a much bigger driver of hypertrophy. The rep range for hypertrophy is much larger than people think. You'll often hear the 8 to 12 reps being hypertrophy. There is some truth to that, but the research, as I understand it now, seems to indicate that 5 reps to 30 reps is sort of your hypertrophic range. It's an enormous range. Part of that's going to be picked based on what is the exercise you're doing. If we're going for hypertrophy, I'm not going to give somebody 20 reps on squat. I'm not that mean of a person. Like, it certainly works. It's just really hard to do. It typically wipes you out. And I mentioned the RPE 10 set of 15 or 20, let's say, on squats. While that probably wouldn't exhaust you for next week's squats, much like a heavy max effort double might, it's certainly going to wipe you out for that workout. You're probably not going to get a whole lot of other productive work that day if you do a max effort set of 20. But at the same time, I probably wouldn't give somebody sets of 5 on leg extensions. That would probably feel awful. My knees would not enjoy that experience. But sets of 20 on leg extensions, very manageable. So part of that range, I think, depends on what is the exercise you're doing, how conducive is the exercise you're doing to the number of reps you're asking it to do. But the range for building muscle is much larger than people typically think, but the total volume is often what drives that long-term muscle growth. Are you doing enough total work at a hard enough difficulty? It doesn't need to be max effort. You don't need to be going to failure. You don't need to be doing every set you possibly can. It's enough work at hard enough. And those thresholds are where things get tricky. I'm going to later do a video where at least I think those thresholds are, but everyone's a bit different, and people respond differently to different types of training. But the hypertrophy, because it is that central and it is the long-term driver of strength, needs to be a key portion in how training is structured and how it's sort of an always there thing. If someone's going from complete beginner, absolutely no muscle mass, to world class, the biggest, most continuous thing throughout that whole process is going to be muscle mass. The only way they're going to get there is a tremendous amount of muscle. They will need to learn how to move efficiently. They will need to have good neuromuscular output. But those are things that you can learn relatively quickly. You could spend a few months dialing into that and really nail those pretty well. But you need to spend years and years building the muscle mass. That is the one that takes the longest. It should have kind of the always in the background kind of a thought process. There are certain phases where you might not. If someone's in competition prep, you might pull back a lot on the hypertrophy work. You might be doing just enough to maintain. But through most phases, for most people, assuming their goal is to get very strong, hypertrophy should be at least a part of the thought a lot of the time, whether it's doing accessories that are in that range, whether it's doing the main work that's in the range. It should ebb and flow in importance depending on what you can do strength phases, but typically people aren't doing phases with zero hypertrophy work. The reason why you might do heavy triples on a squat and then do leg extensions or lunges or hack squats afterwards is you're trying to continue to push that muscle growth piece there that needs to be continually going there. One additional note there is muscle weighs something. If somebody long-term is not going up in body weight, they are probably not getting as strong as they want to be long-term, assuming they are not excessively high in body fat to start. If someone's very over fat to begin with, they can maintain body weight, put on a tremendous amount of muscle, and lose body fat. But if someone is moderately lean, it tends to be much harder to do so. And over the long term, they will need to increase their scale weight to continue to see muscle growth. They could just get leaner and leaner and more muscular and more muscular. At some point, that becomes harder to do. The physiological processes by which you build muscle are harder to do depending on your whether or not you're enhanced, whether you're natural or enhanced. But either way, it becomes harder and harder to do the leaner somebody is. But long term, in order to be putting on muscle, people should be putting on body weight. There should be a very slow upward trend of body weight over the course of someone's strength career if their goal is to get as strong as possible, because that is the highest long-term ceiling of what someone's strength abilities are. Now, when it comes to the sort of phases of that, the basic phasic structure that, let's say someone's going to prep into a powerlifting meet, the way you might order this, and it's a little bit out of order from how I initially explained it, is you might start with a learn to move phase. Like, let's establish someone's ability to do the squat, bench, deadlift. Once you've established that, then we might move into a hypertrophy phase where we're getting the muscles involved with those movements big and strong. Once we do that, then we move on to a strength neuromuscular focused phase. We are trying to make that new muscle stronger. That stronger is sending a better signal from your brain to your muscle. There are some internal pieces as far as the actual contractile fibers changes as well, but for simplicity's sake, I think just simplifying it down to the signal from your brain to your muscle is a encapsulates the requisite training fully. So you need to go make that new muscle now stronger. And then it's especially emphasizing the technique portion into the last phase, which is the peak, where you are taking that now big muscle you've made strong and making it especially good at the competition squat, bench, deadlift. So that early phase is just initially learning that pattern, learning these movements at a very base level. Now this last pattern is sort of combining the neuromuscular and the technique portions to be able to do the competition style lifts specifically at a high level with high neural output while maintaining muscle mass. Muscle mass is still that base of support. That's still what gives you that ability to utilize your neuromuscular output. But the thing that actually takes you to perform well on meet day is going to be that neuromuscular and that technique in the short term. Long term, muscle mass is the driver, but short term, that technique and that neuromuscular adaptations is the driver there. That's kind of the rough outline of those structures there. An additional note as far as how I think sometimes they are misused. There are styles of training that are really heavy, really high frequency. Something like a Bulgarian squat program can be a great tool to learn neuromuscular efficiency and learn technique as well. Basically, the program is you do a 1 rep max squat, usually a front squat, every day. And the actual Bulgarian program, the true one, is multiple times a day. Really high neural output. You're just doing one really heavy rep. That one actually is closer to failure. It's supposed to be a max every time, but that max is going to change because after doing a bunch of them, it's going to go down at some point. But actually, it starts to climb quite fast, but then it hits a ceiling. That's where I think a really good indication or a very good practical application of the muscle mass is that limiter. If you do a program where you are optimizing for neuromuscular adaptations, you will run into a ceiling where you are not able to go further. Go back to the previous conversation about that program structure. If you transition too early before meet from hypertrophy training into strength and then peaking, there's often sort of this, you've gotten everything you can out of a strength peak. There's sort of not as much left to continue on. The peak should be ramping up and up and up. But I've seen people who are not well muscled enough, and the more muscle you have, the longer peak you need. If they aren't well muscled enough and they're taking a peaking program for somebody who's much more well muscled, they peak up and up and up, and then they flatline and they aren't able to go anymore because they don't have enough of a base. The analogy I heard a number of times before is it's a pyramid. You only can build a pyramid as tall as it is wide. If you don't build that base out, it can't go up very tall. And if you have a really wide base, you need time to build out that whole peak. But if you got a very narrow base, you don't need as much time. You don't need as long to do so. But I do think that leads very smoothly into my next conversation, which is about of the power lifts, which I think is the most important per lift. And this also starts to kind of structure how you might consider peaking training for each lift. So of the three, technique, neuromuscular, and muscle mass, for the squat, I think it's actually relatively balanced. I think partially it depends on someone's anatomy. I think this is the most variable. There are people who seem very muscle mass dependent. Just bigger legs means bigger squat. They tend to be more upright, quad dominant squatters. The more bent over of a squatter somebody is, it seems like they're more neuromuscular and more skill based. But it seems a bit more of a depends on the mechanics. There's just a larger variability in the squat. For the bench press, from my experience, it is heavily muscle mass dependent. And I'll briefly mention deadlift. I'll come back to bench press. Deadlift tends to be very neuromuscular, especially conventional deadlift, especially. But both sumo and conventional seem to be very neural dominant. And the little anecdote, I don't have actual science to back this up. This is just from my experience and my observation. I have met a lot of bench press specialists. I have never met a skinny bench press specialist. I've met a number of deadlift specialists. I've met several skinny deadlift specialists who don't look that jacked. They might have a jacked or a relatively muscular upper back, maybe some muscular hamstrings, but they aren't but they aren't especially developed. They aren't a enormous back. They aren't enormous hips. They don't have that massive frame or that massive musculature. Whereas all the bench press specialists I've met have enormous pecs, enormous delts, enormous triceps, enormous back. Everything is huge. They are just really well muscled. And it does seem that the classic wisdom of you put on body weight, your bench press goes up. Part of that's going to be due to you're just putting on more muscle. You have more mass and more muscle there. You also see that I think that PEDs have a disproportionate benefit towards muscle mass of those three categories. You also see that the bench presses in untested tend to be a lot higher relative to tested. That's the biggest delta, whereas the deadlifts in tested to untested has a smaller delta. But then, yeah, going on back onto deadlift, it seems to be more neural. Sumo seems to be more technique and neural. Conventional seems to be more neural, little lower in technique. Muscle mass is important in all of them. So even though I think deadlift has the lowest muscle mass requirements, I've seen people who are very under muscled with pretty decent deadlifts. It's still going to be relevant. Still getting bigger hamstrings, bigger glutes, bigger lats, bigger erectors. Those are going to drive a stronger deadlift, but to a lesser degree than it would drive a bigger bench. You're going to need to probably spend more time in the neuromuscular components. This goes back to the peak structure conversation. If we are building a plan, we might need less time to peak a bench. I know I said that it's partially due to the amount of muscle mass you have, but if a lift, at least in my experience, if a lift seems less neural, it doesn't need as long of a peak. There's less to eke out with the peak. Whereas if a lift is more neural, you need longer to ramp into it. Your neurology needs more time to kind of work up to speed. So for a deadlift, I'll often have somebody, particularly for a strong deadlifter, I'll have a much longer peak into a competition. Whereas for a bench press, it's a much shorter peak. It might be 1/3 as long. Even for a relatively advanced bench presser, it might be 1/3 as long as, assuming they're an equally advanced deadlifter, might be 1/3 as long or half as long as they would be for the other lift. These are kind of rough numbers. It depends on the lifter. It depends on how they seem to respond to training. And there's a lot of individual variations. It's sort of a broad average from what I've observed. But the where someone's strengths and weaknesses lie also sort of inform that. You'll have somebody who's more practiced, who is a more experienced, more veteran lifter, who might not need as much of the technique side of things. You have somebody who's more novice, might need more of that leading into competition or leading into specific phases of training. So you'll have to make some intelligent decisions based on what are the needs that you or your client needs in that situation. But these are at least the frameworks worth discussing there. And then one final note I'll add is the way you might structure, let's say, a peak into a competition or a structure of peak into a competition is dependent on where the person in question, whether you or your client, is at currently, where do they want to be, and what is that missing link / how much time do we have? If someone comes to me like, hey, I want to do a meet and I'm 3 weeks out, putting focus on muscle mass, well, that might be their long-term strategy. That's the best long-term play. It takes too long. Muscle mass takes a long time to build. You are not going to grow an appreciable amount of muscle in 3 weeks. We need to focus more on neuromuscular and technique efficiencies. If someone's like, hey, I want to be the best in the world in a decade, we got to build muscle. That's going to be the focus. Let's put some mass on you, and then we'll worry about the neuromuscular and the skill-based things down the road. But hell, especially with that, if someone's going to put on 100 pounds of muscle in that period, we're going to need to relearn the lifts, because the way that you squat, bench, and deadlift at 270 versus 170 are very different. Your mechanics, your leverages are very different. So the overemphasizing on one too early, you want to make sure they're moving well to lift safely to be able to build muscle effectively and safely long term. But if that's someone's objective, that might be a lower priority. We don't need to have that neural focus as much. Now, if they enjoy it and that keeps them engaged with training, that can be its own reason for doing it. But strictly from a physiological perspective, it may not be required. Um, sort of being able to have a good insight on where someone's at, what they need, what are the relevant pieces to allow them to do their goal on time. Is it a long-term goal? Is it a short-term goal? Do we need to optimize for what their weaknesses are or to lean into their strengths? Figuring out what someone's at right now is a really big part of that appropriate decision making. So hope that all makes sense there. If you have any questions, please leave comments down here. I'll get back to everything. and try to give you some more detail or context, or answer any specifics that you might have. But this is how I conceptualize the 3 ways that somebody can get stronger, and how I build a program and plan a peak to help them do so.